Hello and welcome, everybody. I am so excited to be hosting Amy Berger, who in the low carb space everybody knows, and discussing her pet topic, Alzheimer's disease. Nutrition Network has had lots to do with Amy. Thankfully, she's done lectures for us. She's even written a chapter in a textbook that we've been editing. Amy is absolutely amazing. So I think without further ado, let's get into it and start speaking about why we're here today on World Alzheimer's Day. Alzheimer's is a really, really prevalent condition that affects a lot of people. Amy, firstly, before we get into it, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into the Alzheimer's space?
Sure. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be here with Nutrition Network. I am a low carb and ketogenic oriented nutritionist and writer. And the very, very short version of how I got into low carb and keto in the first place is I used to be heavier. And I really, really struggled for most of my young adult life to lose weight. And it's only when I stumbled upon the low carb diet, and my entry point was Dr. Atkins and the Atkins diet. It's only when I cut my carbohydrate intake that the weight started to come off. And after being in and out of some jobs that I didn't find fulfilling and satisfying, I actually went to graduate school for nutrition and changed careers because, I could help bring this fabulous low carb way of eating to other people. And over the years, even though I personally got into it for weight loss, over the years that I've been learning about, the power of this way of eating and all of the hormonal and biochemical changes that happen when you shift your food this way, I now feel like weight loss is one of the least impressive things that this can do. And not to downplay that. I mean, if you're out there and you're living with morbid obesity or you're struggling to lose weight loss is great. It can change your life, but you can also literally reverse type 2 diabetes. You can reverse PCOS, non-alcoholic fatty liver. You can be rid of all these conditions. So it's just a phenomenally powerful way to eat. And the Alzheimer's thing I got into, if anyone's wondering, like, why on earth would a nutritionist have anything to say about Alzheimer's, especially a low carb type of nutritionist? They regularly call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. So the first time I was ever exposed to that connection was in Gary Taubes's book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. He mentioned a potential connection between glucose and insulin and Alzheimer's. And I'd never heard of that before. And it was a few years after I read that book that I was in school writing my thesis. And when it came time to pick a topic, I said, let me go back to that Alzheimer's thing and see if has research been done on this? Is there even enough research on it already that I could write a thesis? And lo and behold, when I started looking at the published research, it was everywhere, this glucose and the brain and dementia and cognitive decline. And I was shocked at how much research there was, and nobody was talking about it.
And so much research that you managed to turn your thesis into a book called The Alzheimer's Antidote, right? I mean, yeah, that must have been a lot of research out there.
Yeah, when I graduated, I thought, I can't keep this to myself. This is potentially life-changing information. And so I expanded it into a book, and I was lucky that a publisher found it and offered me a book deal. I started it as a little self-published ebook, but it expanded. And at the time, the book has been out for 5 years already. It came out in 2017. And at the time, almost nobody was writing about it. But since then, Dr. Dale Bredesen has his book out. Dr. Mary Newport has some books. So it's getting out there more, but I would say it's still definitely not in the mainstream.
Well, that's why we're having this discussion today. Hopefully we can raise awareness around Alzheimer's disease and its link to diabetes and insulin resistance. So let's start by, just for anyone out there, let's define Alzheimer's disease. What is it and how does it differ from dementia? Because I know that that's kind of in many people's minds one and the same thing. Could you explain Alzheimer's disease to us and dementia to us? And then we can take it from there and move into what causes it and how it can be type 3 diabetes.
Sure. So Alzheimer's is a form of dementia. Like dementia is the larger category that includes several different kinds of cognitive impairment or cognitive decline. So Alzheimer's is one of them. And it is a chronic progressive illness that, starts in a very,
Much like type 2 diabetes, right? We were always told that type 2 diabetes was chronic and progressive, and that we know can be reversed
yes.
by ketogenic or low carb diets.
Yeah. So Alzheimer's is progressive in that it starts in a very mild form. It's actually called mild cognitive impairment. That's the early stage. And as it gets worse and worse, it develops into full-blown Alzheimer's. But it tends to affect older people, although people are being affected younger and younger, just like type 2 diabetes and all of these other metabolic illnesses. So it's not just memory impairment with Alzheimer's. There's personality changes, there's behavioral disturbances, and it like I said, it starts in a very mild form. Nobody wakes up all of a sudden one day with severe impairment. It gets worse and worse over time.
So what happens in an Alzheimer's brain? Why, why is it diagnosed as being an Alzheimer's brain? What's going wrong?
Yeah, the main problem in the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's is that neurons in certain regions have lost the ability to take up and metabolize glucose. And we still don't really know why that's happening, but that is the problem. And so it's almost like these neurons are starving to death. I say that it's a fuel shortage or an energy crisis in the brain. So of course, if these cells aren't getting enough energy, they're gonna they're going to atrophy. You're going to have some cognitive impairment, and Alzheimer's is actually a sort of differential diagnosis. There's no blood test for it. There's certain levels of different molecules they can measure, but it's not like an infectious disease where if you have a certain compound, you have that disease. It's really, there are some diagnostic cognitive tests, tests of memory and word recall and that kind of stuff, that depending on where you score on that, they will diagnose you. But it really is sort of a differential, I think, catch-all kind of diagnosis.
Okay. I think many diseases are, or many conditions are. We can think of things like irritable bowel syndrome or many things. So that makes sense, especially if you can't test for everything in a live human,
Yeah.
on their brain. So if someone were to look at an Alzheimer's brain, like Alois Alzheimer did back in the day when he discovered it, he saw shrinkage of the brain. He saw amyloid beta proteins and tau proteins. So there's a lot of or there has been a lot of kind of insinuations or theorizations that these proteins might be causative in the pathogenesis or the development of Alzheimer's disease. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because that seems to fly in the face of this hypometabolism. So you're saying, just to summarize, you're saying that the neuron is not taking up enough glucose, and so it's shrinking. And as it shrinks, basically the junctions between the two neurons, the synapses, they're going to get further and further apart because the neurons are shrinking. And then eventually it's going to get to a point where that synapse is just so big that the neurotransmitters aren't really going to be able to bridge it. And you're going to start seeing some kind of impairment, I imagine, but you would know that more. But that's kind of where you're coming from. And then you hear the hypothesis that, well, actually there's this buildup of all this amyloid and tau protein stuff, and that's getting in the way of these neural synaptic kind of signals. And actually that's the problem. And we've got to get rid of the tau proteins and especially the amyloid beta proteins in order to fix the Alzheimer's. So can you comment a little bit about these kind of different theories around the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, you've explained it fabulously. It's there's a belief that upon death, you can autopsy the brain of somebody's brain, and you can see that in some people's brains there's a very large buildup of these amyloid beta proteins or beta amyloid, and everybody produces beta amyloid. Healthy brains, everybody produces it. The problem in Alzheimer's is that it builds up and it's not cleared away properly. We'll get back to that in a minute, but there's a lot of flaws to what they call the amyloid hypothesis. Just it fails to explain so many things that we see. And the biggest is that not everybody with Alzheimer's disease has significant amyloid buildup. And then there are many, many people who, after they die, their brain is autopsied, and they do have a lot of amyloid buildup, but they had no cognitive decline. They had no, memory problems at all. So there are people with lots of amyloid who don't get Alzheimer's, and there are people who get Alzheimer's who do not have a lot of amyloid.
Then it simply can't be causative, right? If it's not present in all cases, it isn't the underlying factor.
No, I do think that, like I said, in Alzheimer's, everybody produces amyloid. The problem in Alzheimer's is that it builds up and it's not cleared away. So it is possible that even if amyloid does not cause the disease to take root, and it may exacerbate it, in these proteins build up outside the cells, and they can solidify into these amyloid plaques, these sort of solid plaques that I think do get in the way of that neuronal communication you were talking about. It can sort of like block the synapse, block the neurotransmitters from getting through. That's a simplified explanation, but so it is possible that they are a factor that makes it worse, but they don't cause the disease. And the question would be, why are these amyloid proteins building up? Why aren't they being cleared away properly the way a healthy brain does? And
so that is the question, Amy. So now I think you've asked yourself the $1 million question. Can you answer it for us? Why are they not being cleared away? I mean, we see in traumatic brain injury on the rugby field, for example, the football field, we see that they also have amyloid beta building up in their brains, but then it gets cleared away. So why in the Alzheimer's brain? Firstly, why is it even there? And secondly, why is it not being cleared away like it would be in the rugby player, for example?
Yeah, so that is the $1 million question, like you said. The evidence indicates that amyloid may actually be protective. It may actually be a helpful substance that the brain is deliberately secreting in response to neuronal injury. And so, and the fact is, there have been several drugs developed to reduce the formation of amyloid. Every single one of these drugs has been a massive failure in the real world, meaning the drugs do reduce the amyloid buildup, but the reduction in that amyloid buildup does nothing to improve cognitive function or to slow the decline. So it has no impact on the actual disease process. And in fact, like I said, some researchers think that amyloid may be protective. There was one drug where the clinical trial had to be stopped early because the people on the drug were doing so much worse than the people on the placebo that it was deemed unethical to continue. So they targeted the amyloid, and these Alzheimer's patients got worse. So
well, that's pretty telling, right? I mean, clearly you don't want to be targeting that amyloid. It's there for a reason.
You would think so. You would think it would
you
be
would
telling,
think so.
But
it sounds suspiciously similar to LDL cholesterol. Not that we want to go into that in statins, doesn't it? It may be there for a reason, and statins don't seem to lower your risk of all-cause mortality or cardiovascular disease incidents. Anyway, let's not go there. So amyloid beta protein.
But I don't want to interrupt, but I do want to explain, because you asked about the rugby player, for example. So yeah, when somebody has a traumatic brain injury, even a young, healthy person, we see amyloid, again, maybe that is being secreted deliberately in response to an injury.
That would make sense.
So yeah, and it's Alzheimer's is not the only place we see it.
Why is it not clearing in the Alzheimer's patient then? What's going on?
So the interesting thing, well, one of many interesting things about this condition is that, when something is secreted in the body, there is probably a hormone or an enzyme or something that is responsible for breaking it down and clearing it away. For example, so insulin is a hormone that we all secrete, and there's an enzyme called insulin degrading enzyme. or IDE. And the job of this enzyme is after insulin is secreted and it's doing its job, it can't just stay in the blood forever. So this enzyme comes along and breaks it down and gets rid of it. Oddly enough, insulin degrading enzyme doesn't just break down and clear away insulin. It has many other targets or substrates that it works on, one of which turns out to be these amyloid proteins. So you need this insulin degrading enzyme to clear away these amyloid proteins. And in people, so chronic
it brings us to the chronic hyperinsulinemia. So I think it brings us to that whole type 3 diabetes that you were talking about in the beginning. So so basically, if someone is having a large amount of insulin circulating in their body the whole time because their cells are not responding to insulin properly because they are insulin resistant, whether that's PCOS or type 2 diabetes or any other insulin resistant condition, then they've got lots of insulin circulating, which means that this insulin degrading enzyme then would be preoccupied.
That's what we believe, and that's kind of a simplistic explanation, but yeah, this enzyme is so busy dealing with all the insulin that there's not enough of it left to target the amyloid. It sort of it has a greater affinity for insulin. And there's also evidence that people with the ApoE4 gene, which is the strongest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's, it does not cause Alzheimer's, but it is a risk factor. There's evidence that people who have that ApoE4 gene actually produce less insulin degrading enzyme. So they have even from the beginning, less of an ability to clear that away at all.
That is absolutely fascinating. So now I think we've covered the amyloid beta business, which is really interesting. It looks protective, and it looks like it's not being cleared away because its degrading enzyme is too busy dealing with another fire that it can't be dealing with that one. And we haven't even gone into depth into the other thing that's going wrong, which is the hypermetabolism, where the neuron isn't getting the fuel it needs. So it's shrinking, which is probably the initial injury, right? But I want to go into that. But Dr. Willem Mostert has entered the waiting room. So I'm going to admit him, and then we can let him join the discussion. Dr. Mostert, welcome. You're muted. Could you switch on your video and your microphone, please? It's really great to have you. Very excited to discuss Alzheimer's with both of you. So let me just quickly introduce Dr. Mostert. So I'm going to call him Willem for now. We're all on first name basis. But Willem, hi. We can see you. Welcome. So it's wonderful to meet you because Willem has had, it was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, and he actually reversed it and has since been working in the space with the sole purpose of basically bringing the knowledge to the people so that more people can reverse their mild cognitive impairment or their Alzheimer's disease or their dementia in the same way as he has. And so not only can he share with us his personal experiences and insights in actually doing this, but he also is a very accomplished academic as well. So he can share with us his thoughts on the mechanistic aspects and on what's actually going on in the research as well. So we have two great experts here to discuss this with. So welcome, Dr. Mostert. Okay, so I think I'm just going to continue with what we were discussing so far. What we've discussed is basically what Alzheimer's is, that it's under the umbrella of dementia, that it seems to all Alzheimer's patients share a hypometabolism, so a reduction in their eating of glucose, really. So neurons metabolize or use up glucose, and the Alzheimer's brain neurons seem to be doing less of this. And as such, there seems to be damage to these neurons. They start shrinking. You see the Alzheimer's brain shrinks. And as that happens, there is a bigger space that develops between the synapses, which are the gaps between neurons where they send their messages. And suddenly that gap becomes this giant chasm, this abyss where the the neurotransmitters get lost, and then there's less signaling happening and further shrinkage. And so this is what's happening in the Alzheimer's brain. At the same time, we said that Amy mentioned that because the neurons are getting damaged, there's going to be likely this production of this protective amyloid beta or beta amyloid protein, which is also produced in things like traumatic brain injury when people have had a terrible knock on their head. And then it gets cleared in these people, provided they're metabolically healthy, it appears, possibly. And then, but in Alzheimer's brains, it doesn't. So the amyloid beta or the beta amyloid builds up and possibly worsens this, kind of starts worsening the signaling even more by kind of getting in the way of these synapses even more. So this is kind of where we got up to. And then Amy explained to us that in people who have high circulating insulin levels, so in other words, people who are insulin resistant, insulin's job is to get the sugar out of the bloodstream and put it into the cells to be used as energy. When someone becomes insulin resistant, then the insulin stops being able to work to do that. And so your pancreas has to produce more and more insulin to try and kind of bombard the cells to get that sugar out of the bloodstream and into them. But in the process, high insulin levels aren't good, and they have to be degraded by something which Amy tells us is called the insulin degrading enzyme. And that also, its job is to degrade amyloid. But if it's busy with insulin because you're diabetic or you have whatever else that causes this high circulating insulin level, amyloid's going to build up. So that's, Willem, that's where we were. And now Amy was just about to tell us about the neuron being in this hypometabolic state and how that might be causative. And then I'd like to move on to ask you some questions as well. But I think let's just finish this line of discussion.
Yeah, it's incredible to me that really is the main problem in Alzheimer's disease. And when you go, for example, in the US to the Alzheimer's Association's website, there is not one mention of it. They call it brain glucose hypometabolism. Hypometabolism meaning not enough energy. And it is specific to glucose. And it's that, to me, more so than the amyloid, more so than the tau and the tangles, that the depressed, reduced brain glucose usage is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. And that really is the cause of everything else. When these cells do not have enough energy, like you said, even the shape of the cells, the axon of the neuron gets pulled in to save energy, to keep the cell body alive.
So why is it not getting enough of that glucose when there's plenty of circulating insulin, which job is to get things, get glucose places where it's needed?
And plenty of circulating glucose. It's not that there's not enough glucose available. It's not getting into the brain. And even when it does get into the brain in the early stage, the cells are not taking it up and using it. And I don't think anyone knows for sure why that's happening. That is the problem. We don't know why, except my hunch is that may be a protective mechanism. The brain may be saying, I'm so damaged from so many years of glucose flooding me. I don't want any more. I'm deliberately going to keep it out. And in fact, that's one of the things that amyloid does. Amyloid reduces, it inhibits some of the enzymes in those metabolic processes. So it may be the brain's way of trying to protect itself. The problem is that, okay, it's refusing the glucose, but there's nothing else. There's no alternative fuel. If there was, and we'll get to that, I'm sure, if there was some alternate way of getting energy to these neurons, then the absence of the glucose wouldn't be as big a problem.
And so that brings us to our second $1 million question, doesn't it? The alternative fuel source. So I think, Dr. Master Willem, can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know that, well, actually, maybe take us through your story and how you came across Dr. Bredeson's work and how he kind of introduced you to this alternative fuel source that could fuel your brain, and how you, well, start with that, and then we'll talk about how you implemented that successfully. Oh, you're muted. You should see. Yeah.
Hang on, that's it. I'm too old to try to understand all the dynamics behind why you have Alzheimer's. Now, as a management consultant, I'm a pragmatist. And I've realized pretty soon that Alzheimer's works like a company who's getting bankrupt and it shuts down. And we call it, in the business world, we call it retrenching people. Now, the brain does exactly the same thing. It shuts down and says, okay, I can't, deal with the whole brain anymore. So let me shut down some of the functions of the brain. And unfortunately, in my mind, the first one that goes is the memory center. Why that? I don't know, but that's what happens. That happened to me as well. Now, since I got involved in this world of Alzheimer's and dementia, and I got actually, let me say, cured from dementia, I realized that you have to be very pragmatic, and the sooner you start with preventing this thing from happening to you, the better it is. Lately, I've realized, and I've seen it with the people that I work with. I started with people with dementia, and they all got better. Was no doubt about it. You know, the MOCA test and everything showed that they are better. Their personal perception of it is that they got better. And I realized two things. Most of them were insulin resistant. And after a while, a couple of months, they were not insulin resistant anymore. Some of them were diabetic. Yes,
Dr. Master, you were also type 2 diabetic, weren't you? And overweight as well.
Yeah, I was diagnosed with a score of between 11 and 13. And then I got hold of Dr. Bredeson's world. And I would say within less than 6 months, I had no insulin blood sugar problem at all. And that is what I realized with the people that I helped. They all got better. They became insulin sensitive again. And another thing that I observed is they all lost weight significantly. Those who were quite overweight lost a lot of weight, and those that were a little bit overweight got to a normal weight. But then I came across a study that was done by the London University, about with 6,000 people aged 50. And after 15 years, none of them had dementia risk factors. And after 15 years, those who were overweight had almost a 40% chance of getting dementia or already got dementia. And then I realized maybe the soonest symptom that one should actually look at is people who are becoming overweight, because they are the most at risk for developing diabetes and for having high inflammation levels and those kind of things.
Well, that makes sense, because that makes so much sense, because if you look at who's insulin resistant, often, yes. I mean, the first signs, well, the first sign of kind of bad insulin resistance will be metabolic syndrome. And one of the most visible sign actually of metabolic syndrome will be central adiposity, will be a belly, will be being overweight. So I agree with you. I think that would definitely be the first sign that someone could see without doing blood tests, without doing blood pressure, without testing blood lipids. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that was my experience really in my own life. I lost a lot of weight. I became insulin sensitive again. I was off all the medication that I had, and then I realized
your diabetes reversed and your mild cognitive impairment reversed.
Yes, to the extent that actually I found there was a change in my brain patterns or the functionality of certain areas in my brain. I was also diagnosed way back when I was still a child as being hyperactive, attention deficit disorder. And since I got on this lifestyle approach, that changed completely. I was very impulsive in my younger life, made stupid decisions and whatever. Now my brain is far more organized. And I believe that's the prefrontal cortex that has actually come to life at the age of 68 or whatever, which was quite a surprise to me. But that really happened to even that my colleagues say to me, listen, you are more systematic in terms of your thinking and that kind of thing. So that came as a surprise to me, but I experienced it myself.
Wow, that's
so really,
fascinating.
The fact that the insulin resistance disappeared had a tremendous impact on my life, and the way I think about things and the way I approach problem solving, those kind of things.
So I'd be very interested in what you have to say about that, Amy. What do you think could be going on in the brain to improve the Alzheimer's, or the mild cognitive impairment in Dr. Moss's case, but concurrently improve ADHD symptoms or focus or mental organization? Is there anything that you know of through your research that you could think of might be responsible for that? Or do you think it's just an anecdote or a chance?
Oh, I don't think it's anecdotal at all. I think there's pretty clear rationale or explanation for that. Just having stable blood sugar, not having these very highs and especially the lows, you're going to have more stable, not only more stable thinking, but more stable moods. And less irritability, less anger, but also definitely I think there is a role for whatever level of ketones somebody is generating. The ketones are just, that's the $1 million.
So the second, I think that does bring us to the second $1 million question. So Amy, can you take us there? Can you tell us now about this alternative substrate that we could be providing the mild cognitive impairment brain or the Alzheimer's brain with, to make up that deficit that's not being met by glucose? How would that work, and how would it look in practice?
Yeah, in my opinion, this is the most encouraging, most promising thing about Alzheimer's research right now. Even though the neurons are impaired in their ability to take up and use glucose, they can still take up and use ketones. And I don't think you'll ever get 100% closing that fuel gap, but you can close it somewhat. And people who do that tend to have improved cognition. And this comes from the work of Stephen Cunnane at Sherbrooke University in Canada. It's just the most encouraging thing that you can either do this. Most of the research is done using medium chain triglyceride drinks or formulas, or coconut oil. They're only now starting to do larger trials of people on ketogenic diets. But I think any method you can use to get ketones into the brain is valid and should be looked at, whether that's the diet, the MCT oil, or exogenous ketones, or all of them. Why not do all? They don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can follow a ketogenic diet and use the exogenous ketones or the MCT oil. But that's the main thing, is that even though the brain is not using glucose properly, it will take up and use ketones. So you can reduce that degree of fuel shortage a little bit.
So would you expect to see those neurons getting bigger or recovering at all with this new fuel, or would you just expect to see the cognitive decline slow?
I think it may be both. I think if it's caught early enough, you can probably maybe reverse it, or at least stop it from progressing. I think more research remains to be done on that, but I do think the earlier you catch it, the less severe the damage is, the easier it's going to be to come back from it.
Okay, so Dr. Mostert, yes, I wanted to also find out what you did to make that happen in your, I mean, we haven't looked at your neurons, but it looks like from clinically you have improved. So tell us more about it and tell us what you did.
Yeah. I don't think your brain cognition, your brain performance can improve if it doesn't grow new neurons and new synapses. That's just that's my perception about it. It's certainly happened with me. But I tell you what, the people that I work with, now, as I said, I'm a management consultant. So in business, you tend to measure, you have key performance areas and you measure them. And if you measure them, you can improve stuff. I follow the same approach with my patients. I measure about, on a daily basis with them, I measure about 10 to 15 different aspects of their life. Now, one thing that we measure is the ketones. We measure blood sugar, we measure blood pressure, we measure how long they sleep, how long they fast, how much protein they take in, how much fat they take in, and how much carbs they take in, and various other things. What is the earliest point in time that they get sun in their eyes? So I measure all those things. And the people who do well on all those dimensions are the ones who improve in terms of cognition, their insulin resistance disappear, and their energy increases, and they feel much better about themselves anyhow, and they lose weight. There's no doubt about those things. If you do those things and you improve on those dimensions, you get better.
So Dr. Marston, what if I had to force you to choose 3 of those that you feel are most important or most influential in your patients' lives and in your life, what 3 of your 14 to 19 things would you choose?
I would say to you, don't force me to use 3. Force me to use
okay, five.
No, as many as possible you can handle in your life. Now, the first one is you must get enough fat. It's good fat. There's no doubt about it. You must not eat too much protein. You must reduce your carbs for the first, I would say, 3 months to below 25 grams of net carbs, irrespective of what your weight is. Then you must fast. There's no doubt about that fasting has a significant impact on your ketone levels. You must exercise. There's no doubt about that. You have to exercise. If you do those things and you add good sleep to it, because if you don't sleep, autophagy don't happen and your brain gets confused. So I would say those 6, if you want to really prevent any downward spiral in your cognition, do those 6 things. There's no doubt
so it was the, let's see if my brain's working. It was the fat, because ketones generally made from fat, and especially if you want to use things like Amy was mentioning, MCT oils or things that are particularly going to be made into ketones, then that would be helpful. So it was the fat. Then you said limit protein, which is an interesting one. I'd like to examine that one further. But protein has got an insulin, it does produce insulin or promote insulin secretion to a certain degree. So that's why protein is also limited in
I would say use the right amount of protein for your body. Maybe
so what is that to you? What do you feel that is?
My weight is, well, let me see, 74, and I don't use more than, let's say, 40 to 50 grams of protein per day.
Okay, that's low.
Yeah, that's low, but most people shouldn't have more than that, given that kind of weight.
So why do you feel that way?
I don't know. That just works for me, you know.
Okay, that's really interesting.
I use a plant-based diet.
Okay.
And I supplement that with protein, and I supplement it with high fat.
Okay, and where do you get your fats from?
Just from olive oil, nuts, and from a little bit of coconut oil and coconut milk.
Okay, and coconut oil is very high in MCT oil, or in medium chain triglycerides, which will then promote ketones. So that's really interesting. So I want to get Amy's opinion. I've got a dog scratching at the door, so I'm going to mute myself and stop my video while I go and stop that noise. But while I do, Amy, can you tell us, because this is interesting. I find the protein thing very interesting when it comes to ketones, and my understanding would be I would never drop below 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight for protein.
That's more or less, that's about what I take. That's 0.8.
But most people who aren't looking for, let's say, treating conditions like Alzheimer's or epilepsy or cancer with a ketogenic diet, normally we're pushing that protein a lot higher. Amy, what's your feeling on protein? I'm really interested to hear while I go let that dog.
Well, I think what you said, it's everything is context dependent. I think if somebody there are a lot of elderly people afflicted with this condition who I would like to see them err on the side of more protein, because they may already be frail and undernourished. And I don't want them doing fasting. If they skip a meal here and there, or they have an eating window, that's fine. But I don't encourage people that may be frail or underweight to do extended fasting.
I would agree with you on that.
Yeah. But I do think, and the carbohydrate level is interesting. You know, I think you said 25 net carbs. For some people that will work. Some people are going to have to, in order to produce therapeutic levels of ketones, they may have to go more like 20 or 25 total carbs. Just some people, 25 net could actually be a pretty substantial amount of carbohydrate. But everybody's different. And I think like I was saying, you could use the coconut oil or MCT oil and exogenous ketones regardless of the diet someone follows, even Dr. Newport's work shows that even in somebody on a high carbohydrate diet, if you give them MCT oil or exogenous ketones, it may be able to help, because they will still have circulating ketones, even though they're on a normal sort of mixed higher carb diet. So I think it does have to be individualized. I worry that older people actually already aren't getting enough protein.
No, it is definitely individualized. The women that I deal with, we start them on 25 grams of carbs. Then they started losing weight, but at some point in time, we increased the carb levels a little bit, say with every 3 days. And some, go up to 40 grams of carbs without stopping the weight loss process. Some of them, that weight loss process stopped the moment you go up above 25. And we give them more carbs and try to find out what is that ceiling for every woman that we deal with, because we believe that the thyroid gland needs a bit of sugar to function pretty well. And we found that, the moment they feel tired and whatever, we up the carbs, but then we measure their weight loss and the ketone level, so that they still have ketones with higher carb levels and they still keep losing weight. Now, I deal with. Yes, go ahead.
No, so I think that's really interesting. I think what this shows us is that there are many ways to skin a cat, if you will. And as Amy said, and you've also said, you could kind of play with the carbs, play with the protein, and make it very individualized. So if you're dealing with an elderly patient who might have dentures and loss of appetite and be frail, you're going to want to probably push the protein up and rather drop the carbs lower, and in order to kind of produce those ketones and maybe play with the fats a bit, so you're getting more MCT oils, maybe even exogenous ketones. But if you're dealing with someone who maybe wants to go eat a bit more plant-based, then you're not going to be able to get the carbs as low as like below 20-25 grams. It's going to be almost impossible. And so maybe if in someone like that who still wants to achieve similar benefits but aren't going to go lower in carbs, maybe there you can reduce the protein a little bit if they're strong and fit and maybe not at risk of osteoporosis or anything, and all those kind of things. So I think it is individualized, and it's also what the patient or the person is going to follow as well, and how much buy-in from the family. So I think all these things play a role. I would also err on the side of just higher protein generally, but then I don't deal with many Alzheimer's patients. For me, I'm not looking at well, sometimes I would be looking at therapeutic levels of ketones, but mostly it's lower levels you can get by with and still achieve the same ends. So I think we've got to start wrapping up soon. So I know that you talk a lot about habits, and you, Dr. Mostert, you've spoken about how you have 19 health goals and 19 habits that correlate with those health goals. And those were the ones that you used to improve your health. Could you maybe list or summarize those for us briefly, so we could kind of we know that diet's important. We know that ketones are going to be an alternative fuel source for the brain, but, so I'm assuming diet is one of them, or going on a ketogenic diet is one of them. Can you tell us a few of the others before we wrap up?
Let me give you two more. I try to learn things on a daily basis that is new to my brain. That I make a point of that. Now, fortunately, as a management consultant, I deal with very complex problems in the business world, and I have to find creative solutions for that. So I would say that is one of the most important things if your brain is losing its functionality.
So keep learning. So we've got a ketogenic diet and we've got keep learning.
Keep
give us another one.
And the last one is detox yourself on a regular basis.
What do you mean by that?
I mean with that, we all live in a world where toxins get into your body in all sorts of ways. And if you don't look after your detox systems, you're going to accumulate toxins over a period of time, which is one of the main reasons why many people develop Alzheimer's, is because of that. So, and if you don't detox, people who are overweight find it difficult to lose weight. So I would say keep your brain healthy by learning new things and keeping it active, and detox regularly.
Well, that's very interesting. So I think we need another whole live session to discuss that, because we know that most of the toxins are stored in fat. You release, you start burning the fat, and you're going to have a release of toxins. You're going to have a release of toxic foods, if you will, even in the form of polyunsaturated fatty acids that you might have stored in your fat that gets broken down and now is causing all sorts of havoc. I'll class that as a toxin too, especially once it's been damaged. So I think you're right. I think we do have, all these things that are released when we are losing weight and becoming healthy. And if you look at someone like Sally Norton's work on oxalates, I mean, there's a lot of that. So I think if anyone's interested, this is out of beyond the scope of this discussion, but I think it's definitely something that's very interesting and warrants further investigation. So Dr. Mostert, Willem, Amy, thank you so much for your time. Before we go, I want take home points. But before,
we just have
Amy.
1 minute, I just want to just inform people that we've been touching so much on the diabetes and insulin resistance angle contributing to cognitive decline, but people must be aware that a vitamin B12 deficiency all by itself can cause cognitive impairment. It can cause neurological and neurodegenerative issues. And statin drugs, not all of them, but the lipophilic statins, the ones that cross the blood-brain barrier, do have a potential side effect of memory loss and confusion. And that is on in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration's website states that very clearly. And I think Dr. Mostert, that Dr. Bredesen tends to get his patients off of statins because they can, so this insulin glucose thing is one aspect, but there are other things that can contribute that people really need to be aware of, I think.
So you don't want to be,
one last thing.
Sorry.
Can I say one last thing? If your GP tells you that you have dementia and nothing can be done about it, please don't believe him.
That's a good take-home message. That's a good take-home message, because Dr. Willem is a perfect example of how that is not true. Clearly, something can be done about it. Clearly, you are on top of your game. So yeah, I think you're a walking, talking example of how something can certainly be done about it. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with?
No, thanks to people like Amy who's doing research on this so that we need to learn more and more about it. Thanks for that.
Amy, what's your take-home message, your last words of wisdom for us?
I'm going to echo what Willem said, that this is not a hopeless situation. We know a lot more than you think we do, and there are actions you can take to improve your cognitive function and to reduce the risk of you developing problems. Now, there may be a point of no return there. If you have an elderly, there may be a point where the damage is so severe that you can't change it, but it's always worth trying. The younger you are, the more mild the situation is, the more effective these changes can be. But don't give up. There is hope. There is something we can do about this.
Definitely.
Thank you so much. What a privilege to speak to both of you. Thank you for sharing your words of wisdom and your words of hope. And they're realistic words of hope, right? They really can be something done about this. So really inspirational. And I think that's really what we need on World Alzheimer's Day, for this so-called chronic progressive condition that really can be reversed or at least improved using interventions that we've spoken about today. There are so many more and in more detail, which is also covered in Nutrition Network's neurology course, where we've spoken about Alzheimer's and other neurological aspects that can be addressed with a ketogenic diet. Remember, the ketogenic diet came into the limelight due to epilepsy, which is, a neurological condition. So it's definitely, that's where it's kind of became famous, if you will. So it's definitely a worthwhile course if you're interested. We're also just about to launch a course on resilience and dealing with stress, deal with things like burnout, what happens physiologically when a person experiences chronic stress. And I know, Dr. Mostert, you also have mentioned that in your talks in the neurology course on how stress and chronic inflammation can affect the brain as well. So we deal with all of that in the neurology course, but we actually deal with the resilience and the stress and the burnout part in the resilience course, which is being launched at the end of this month. And then also, please don't miss the World Nutrition Summit food and sugar addiction symposium, which is happening on the 3rd of November, which will be discussing all things to do with processed food addiction, which is a major thorn in the side of success in people's lives, when they could achieve so much, but they have to overcome this mountain that can feel that, well, what can feel like a mountain of processed food addiction, and we discuss how to deal with that, and it's a really, really worthwhile summit, worthwhile discussion. So please join us for that on the 3rd of November. Get in touch with Nutrition Network. There will be all the information in the links under this video. It's been absolutely wonderful chatting to our experts, and wonderful having you all as our audience. Thank you so much for watching, and please share this with your family members, friends, or anyone who might be experiencing memory loss, mild cognitive impairment, or have a loved one who is. Hopefully we can shed some light and provide some hope to all of them. Thank you.